In Part 1, we discussed the inconsistencies in our current historical narrative and discussed the possible origin of racism. In Part 2, we will be going one step further to uncover some of these mysteries. The purpose of Part 1 was not to try to convince you that certain groups or historical figures were black people, but rather to question the concepts of race. Many Moorish people would be legally defined as white even without the typical features of what we would consider a white person. We can look to nature to help us understand certain concepts in the macrocosm of the universe. However, after doing the research for this video, I found that this is not always consistent. Although this animal is technically the same as this animal, we know this was not achieved naturally. This was achieved by mutations as a result of inbreeding or also many things we perceive to be white, such as certain foods and products, are not originally white and have to go through processing or bleaching to appear so. Does this mean white people are a result of eugenics? Some evidence points to this, but it may be more complicated than that. Humans come in all shapes, colors and sizes. If we are to assume there are distinctions among us, what logical ways can we make the argument for the existence of these mutations? One is evolution, another is otherworldly manipulation, and another is eugenics. There are tons of different narratives attached to each theory, but based on this information we can separate this into a few categories. One is the eugenics theory. This would suggest that white people may have once been tribes of people with a darker pigment that for whatever reason have changed over time.
You probably wouldn't take them to be black people. You might not look black, but you got the black blood into you. Well, my name is Roberta Jeanette Orler, but I go by Bert for a nickname. I've lived here all my life. On my job that I had worked at, they took me to be white. And my best friend, she took me to be white. She was shocked when I told her I'm not white. I am black. I am a black person. And it was, well, you're not that. You think you are. No, I know I am. I was raised that way. But I was also raised, as Mom would say, it doesn't matter what color your skin is. We all serve one God. Now, as you know, this is my home. Over here is my daughter's home, Jessica. Everybody else in here, we're all kinfolks. That's how this community got to be mixed with white and black. It was from the black children. Our children going out marrying white and bringing them in. A lot of them was as light as I am, but we still said we were black. And then we had some real dark ones, but that's okay. They were black, we were black. So that's how this all got started. My grandma, she was half Turk, half black. My grandpa was a white man. My mom registered me as black. My mom she wasn't as fair complected as I am. She was a light tan brown. My dad, he has German, Irish, white. Well, his mother was a white woman. His dad was a colored man. And then as I grew older and I got married and I had my children, I registered my children as black.
I have found that stone that was here down the mountain.
Most of them in this area goes as black. We've got maybe 2-3 families that considers themselves being white. But the rest of us in here, we consider ourselves being black.
You know this country is prejudiced, always have been, and it never will grow out of it. I was in the service in '66. Yeah, I circled black, Negro. He said, you can't circle that. I said, that's what I am. Well, he kind of smiled.
We should first try to define whiteness. This is difficult because throughout time, different groups we consider white today were not always considered so.
Who counts as white? This seems like a straightforward question, but the answer is more complicated than you might think. My name is Teresa Travatari, and I am a member of the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau. Today's ideas about race are only about 350 years old, and they are changing all the time. Most Americans would classify anyone with mostly European ancestry as white, but this wasn't always the case. Italians, Irish, Eastern Europeans, and European Jews have all been defined as non-white, lowly, dark races distinct from the racial superiority attributed to Northern Europeans. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, white refers to a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. That means that Persians, Arabs, and Northern Africans are counted as white. Many Latinos are too, because, according to official U.S. statistics, Latino is not considered a racial category at all. And what about the term Caucasian? This term was coined by Johann Blumenbach in 1795. After analyzing his collection of human skulls from around the world, he classified humans into 5 racial categories. One of these was Caucasian. Based on his pseudo-scientific methods, Blumenbach concluded that human beauty reached its peak among the peoples of the Caucasus Mountains, identifying this place on the border between Asia and Europe as the origin of the white race. Caucasus Mountains, Caucasian. According to Blumenbach, Caucasians hail from Europe, Northern Africa, the Middle East, and as far east as northern India. The same areas used by the Census Bureau today to define who counts as white.
Since whiteness may not even be a real thing, for the sake of this video we will define it as the absence of pigment as well as the absence of woolly textured hair. As no matter what culture or country you belong to, having dark skin with kinky hair will likely have you considered black by that population. Nipple color was also used to determine one's racial identity, for example in the case Rhinelander versus Rhinelander, 1925, where Kip Rhinelander, a wealthy man, attempted to divorce his wife Alice Jones, claiming he did not know of her Spanish aka black ethnicity. The trial was notorious for Jones being asked to display her breast to the jury in the judge's chambers. Nipple color is determined by skin pigmentation, with some white and Hispanic people bearing brown nipples and others pink. I have never seen or been able to find any evidence of a black dark-skinned person with pink nipples. However, pink nipples can occur in black people due to albinism, so with that we can imply that the presence of brown nipples may be one way to prohibit one's whiteness even with the presence of pale skin. We discussed albinism in part 1, and this is interesting because we can use albinoid animals as an example to determine that this particular mutation does not prove the presence of a secondary race or species. Is albinism more obvious or pronounced in specific phenotypes? If you were a colored person and saw white albinos, would you assume they are suffering from albinism, or would you assume you're looking at any other white person? It is also said that all blue-eyed people share a common ancestor. This could explain why blonde hair and blue eyes would be considered the ideal eugenics model, as this would be the highest form of the condition. What's interesting is Caucasian does not necessarily describe pale Europeans, as we can see with this chart shown in part 1. Though many people who are considered white today admittedly come from melanated Moorish or Jewish bloodlines. Also stated in part 1, Aryanism was the concern of genetic mixing with what was considered inferior Slavic DNA. With this information, we can assume some white people consider other white people as genetically inferior. Is it possible these quote-unquote white people who were so concerned with genetic mixing were actually Moorish or Jewish people who have since become pale and feared being indistinguishable from the Slavs they were concerned with? It is important to note that Slav is actually where we get the term slave from. This implies these people possibly originated as a sort of underclass, which would explain the discriminatory feelings towards them, some of which continues to this day. But if black means pale or albino as we've established in part 1, then, what does white mean? The word white can be traced back to its Old English origins through the word white, which means bright, radiant, clear, fair, or a highly luminous color devoid of chroma. White can be translated from Proto-Germanic as white, Frisian white, Old Norse whiter, Dutch wit, and Gothic as hvate, from the root quate, which means light, or in Slavonic sveteti, which means to shine. Let's rewind a bit to the Old English definition: a luminous color devoid of chroma. Chroma is described as an intensity of distinctive hue or degree of departure of a color sensation from that of white or gray, which can be translated from the Latinized form of Greek chroma, chroizin or krostheni, which means surface of the body. skin, color of the skin, or to color, stain the surface of the body or to take on a color or hue. This definition is very interesting because it also implies that this is some sort of condition or effect. In the first video I referenced the channel Mind Unveiled, and this was not to pick on this channel or point out its inconsistencies to disregard the research presented. This was done because there is a series on this channel that is very interesting as far as discovering the mystery behind white people. I had to do my own research on this topic because it's something I was not familiar with prior to watching his videos. In part 1 I state that it seems apparent that something happened a few hundred years ago that drastically changed the color of many local populations in various countries. The current historical narrative would suggest colonization, and Mind Unveiled suggest white people have always been around as a result of an angelic race of pale beings.
The original white people that we have in history are of the Aryan or ancient Hyperboreans, who were fair-skinned with red and blonde hair. Their homeland is in ancient Ibernia in the far north. The Tuatha De Danann were a godlike race of beings with blonde, red hair, blue-green eyes. The ancient myth of the Tuatha De Danann is an Irish legend of the Fomorians or the Lemurians coming into Hyperborea or Ibernia. Now, different planets or different stars create different races. We have one race, which is white, which is Hyperborea, and it's under the sun, Mercury. Then we have Lemuria, that is actually under the sun, Mars.
It is obvious that many of the storylines presented to us in the mainstream narratives as well as the sciences, folk tales and religions act as allegories to esoteric information. With this said, we shouldn't disregard or fully accept anything we're told without the proper knowledge and discernment. So as much as different races coming from different planets may be a possibility, there is no current way of presenting that information in an intellectual and factual capacity. The information we will be referring to on this channel are the videos regarding Cabbage Patch babies and incubator babies. Even if white people are a result of eugenics, what kind of genetic program could have created this many white people so fast and for what reason? Statistics show white women have lower fertility rates compared to black women. And it's known it's more difficult and in some cases impossible to naturally breed mixed species. This is where things get interesting.
As we continued to look through these old postcards, a very strange and unsettling trend started to become apparent. It began with just simple baby postcards. At first thought, it seems like any ordinary postcard. But as with the Same Sky postcard mystery, where the author began to see a trend of a variety of postcards, well, there's a category of postcards that deserves its own name and label, but it doesn't seem very well known, as there are no websites or videos explaining this topic. We shall call it the mystery of the repopulation postcards. There are other names for this style, such as baby postcards. By the end of this video, you'll be shocked at how many of these there are. We're talking in the thousands. We found one reference to what these cards were in a book on Amazon named Babylon, Surreal Babies, in which the author describes these same peculiar 1900s postcards and how they were deeply influential to many famous artists, including Salvador Dali. Yet, the author even admits that little is known of their history. In order to understand why we've labeled them repopulation postcards, a thorough understanding of resets, Tartaria, orphan trains, incubators, asylums, and Oddfellows will be necessary. These cards depict babies being grown. There are many different styles within this category. One of the most interesting is the Cabbage Patch babies, a variety of themes involving growing babies. babies on plants, babies on mushrooms, babies in the water. Babies in a nest, babies in eggs being hatched. Then the babies arrive on the train. There's something eerie about these photos, as if someone's trying to tell us something.
We've also got kids in Cabbage Patches. Does this have anything to do with the Cabbage Patch Kids? So where do babies come from? In the early 1900s, the most common answer given to children would simply be that the stork would bring the babies, or that they were found in a cabbage patch. But why would babies be found in cabbage patches? The legend of the Cabbage Patch Kids involves a young boy named Xavier who meets a mystical fairy bunny bee creature, so a hybrid or chimera, and he follows this bunny bee through a secret tunnel behind a waterfall. On the other side of this waterfall, he finds that babies are being produced in a cabbage patch. The stork, known as Colonel Casey, would then come and pick up the babies. He even has his own uniform. So he's a worker, a soldier, as well as the Cabbage Patch Kids' official historian that would then deliver the babies to their new homes. Not only that, but there's an evil witch named Lavender McDay. She and her weasel and jackrabbit henchmen are literally trying to enslave the Cabbage Patch Kids to be miners to dig for gold in the valley. You can get all the exposition for the lore in the story through their 10-song album. It goes over how they were created, to the witch, to even a lament about their enslavement. It's pretty dark. The original concept for the cloth dolls was created by Martha Nelson Thomas, and she called them doll babies. And the story really had nothing to do with cabbages or chimeras or witches. It wasn't until Xavier Roberts, or Xavier, like the little boy in the story, hijacked her design that it became what it is today. So I can't help but wonder if Xavier Roberts just came up with the story all on his own. Like, did it come to him from the collective consciousness? Or does he just have a soft spot for child labor? There's actually a place you can go in White County, Georgia, where they do live births, and you can look it up on YouTube to see what I'm talking about. The bunny bee character also is a hybrid creature of two animals that both symbolize rebirth and resurrection on a mass scale. As we know, rabbits reproduce in droves, and the bee symbolism makes me think of a hive, or a queen or source where all the offsprings originate from. It would seem that this is some sort of reference to babies being created in a lab on a mass scale. Why were there so many orphans? Most common answer will be, the baby boom. But this didn't happen until 1946 to 1964. These postcards are from 1890 to 1910. And there's really no explanation for the burst of orphans that we see being brought into the United States, or the amount of orphanages and asylums that exist that no longer seem to be necessary. Could the baby boom narrative be a way to sweep this part of history under the rug? The orphanages were all shut down, and after the 60s, people just stopped having babies and getting married after World War II, according to the narrative. Then there were the incubators of the 1900s. It's difficult to keep premature babies alive with modern technology, yet they were doing this back in 1835 in Europe. They turned this into a sideshow, where at the world fairs they would show off these child hatcheries, these incubators of live children, and for some reason the royals would come and witness these events. So there's this genetic manipulation cloning idea, in which these babies are actually being grown in some sort of pods. Perhaps the symbolism of the Cabbage Patch mirrors that process. Humans do resemble plants in the way that we're connected to a stem in our fetal state, and our whole lives are spent ripening. In the fetal abduction theory, we typically see a nurse-looking woman with either a fishing hook or a fishing net pulling a child out of the water. Perhaps the hook and net represent medical tools and the water amniotic fluid. In either scenario, it would make sense that these babies have to end up in incubators or hatcheries. And it begs the question, how did all these premature babies get here? If women back in, these days were having babies prematurely, why in such large numbers? And the babies all being babies, they'd have to have traveled there somehow within a short period of time. What are the chances that so many premature babies were driven from wherever their mothers were to these incubators all in time? And why do they charge people to view them as if this was some sort of exhibition or sideshow and not a pressing matter of life and death? For centuries, the stork has been thought of as a symbol for new beginnings and family lineage. The idea that this creature represents life-giving events also makes sense because storks are monogamous creatures, and they mate only once every year with their partners that they've chosen beforehand, choosing mates based solely on personality instead of looks, like many other birds. Now we've got kids inside a train. Orphan trains. Why so many orphans? Were these orphans taken from their families? Were they trained to instruct a new generation of genetically created babies? Or were they womb-napped babies? And we've got kids growing on trees. Kids being carried by storks. The Greek goddess Hera and her Roman counterpart Juno also favor the stork. And I'm sure you guys remember that quirky little teen pregnancy movie from the 2000s. And I suspect that Artemis of Ephesus is an ancient fertility symbol used by the elite to signify their ability to reseed a new population.
The babies are also ready to join their elite clubs, and they're even given top hats. Technology, clothes, and empty cities? Babies floating in on boats, all signifying children being born or found and then taken by the mother, the one with the basket. Yet, this is a figure that represents the government's function as a mother, a corporate operation of generating foundlings in order to fill their newly emptied and burned cities with new humans. Whoever made these postcards are trying to tell us something very dark about the world we live in. Supposedly, the world's first narrative film, the first real movie ever, is called La Fée aux Choux, or The Cabbage Patch Fairy, from 1896. Now that was the 1900s version. There's some controversy on the film outside of the entire Cabbage Patch repopulation subject because the director was a woman named Alice Guy and later was named Alice Guy Blanchet, which creepily is the same exact woman from the postcards. The 1896 film La Fée aux Choux, The Fairy of the Cabbages, is a lost film directed by Alice Guy, and so supposedly they recreated this film multiple times. You will see this happen with many lost films, and that's its own subject that there may be something else going on with all these early films and we're not really told about it. Quote, "Many films of the silent era have been lost. The Library of Congress estimates 75% of all silent films are lost forever. About 10,000 American silent films were produced, but only 2,700 of them still exist in some complete form."
Have you ever heard of Alice Keith Bushing.
I'm a filmmaker. I've never even heard of that.
I've never heard of Alice. I'd heard of her no, I'd never heard of her.
I think people will think you're making it up.
Two really stuck out to me in this collection, because they made it clear that these postcards had to do with repopulation without any question. In this depiction, we can see that there are cabbage and rose seeds being mixed into a device that then produces babies in mass, while the woman in the red dress catches the baby, then they fall out of her dress, and then on top of that, she's holding the clock weight signifying changing time. There's another illustration that translates to repopulation tank or center, and we see a giant woman, the one in the dress, being the symbol for the Cabbage Patch Kids, generating many kids that go flying in the air as the man with the top hat begins pumping to fuel the operation.
Let's discuss orphan trains. We all know before labor laws, many children were forced to work like adults under extremely harsh conditions. Maybe some of you have seen these pictures of hundreds of children being transported on these trains. Or maybe you've heard of the children's book Boxcar Kids or some reference to this.
In the mid-19th century, anywhere from 10,000 to 30,000 orphan children lived in New York City. Charles Brace had a solution. Send these orphans by train to small towns across America and put them up for adoption. Over the course of 75 years, the orphan trains brought more than 200,000 abandoned children to new homes. In 1848, Charles Loring Brace arrived in New York on a mission to aid New York's poor immigrant population. After graduating divinity school, Reverend Brace worked at the 5 Points Mission, a charitable organization in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods that also became a home for its orphan children. In 1853, Brace founded the Children's Aid Society, an organization still active today. New York had as many as 30,000 orphans, almost 6% of the entire population of the city. But at the time, the label of orphan didn't just apply to the parentless. Some families just couldn't take care of their children in the harsh conditions of New York's slums. Many of these orphans were children of recent immigrants who, if they could find jobs, were forced to take dangerous, low-paying work. Dying on the job was not uncommon. Dying at home was also not uncommon. These immigrants mostly lived in cramped, unsanitary tenements where disease easily spread. Their children could be orphaned if one parent died and the other couldn't care for them. Sometimes both living parents gave up their children simply because they didn't have the resources to ensure their survival. Reverend Brace recognized that the best chance for those orphaned was not in the asylums and juvenile prisons where they were normally sent, but with actual families. So, under the Children's Aid Society, he hatched a plan. Orphaned, homeless children at least 6 years old, which was considered working age, would be placed on trains heading out to America's farmlands. The hope was that they would be adopted by new families and grow up in a more peaceful, rural setting, away from the dangers of the city. The first orphan train left in 1854, 42 children bound for apple-picking country in Michigan. All orphan trains were supervised by a Western agent who was responsible for picking the small towns where the children had the best chance of being adopted. The agent would bombard the town with advertising banners and pamphlets announcing the orphans' arrival and their availability for adoption. On the day the orphans arrived, interested families would gather at the town hall, courthouse, or theater to inspect the potential adoptees. Children were placed on a stage or elevated platform, physically put up for adoption. They were poked and prodded, examined thoroughly for their health and physical capabilities. Once potential parents made their selections and the selection committee of prominent townsfolk approved, the orphans were handed over. Families were only allowed to take one child, so any siblings traveling together would almost always become separated. Any children left over would move on to the next town. In their new homes, the freshly adopted orphans were encouraged to forget their past lives in New York completely, and in some cases, adopt the religious beliefs of their new families. Most learned farming skills, but some families treated their new children more as indentured servants, sometimes accompanied by abuse, which often went unchecked by the Children's Aid Society. So, what happened to these orphan-trained children? Like their childhoods, their adulthoods varied. The program produced many successes, including 2 future governors who traveled on the same orphan train. But the notorious outlaw Billy the Kid also rode west on an orphan train. In 1910, a survey concluded that 87% of the orphans had done well, although the term done well was not clearly defined. The orphan train ceased operating in the 1920s as federal, local, and state governments enacted new child labor laws and assumed control for the care of orphan children.
For a 75-year period of American history, an estimated 200,000 orphaned, homeless, and poor children were relocated across the country.
This is the heartland of the country. This is the heartland of where the orphan train riders were placed. It began in New York. They were placed in 47 states and a few in Canada. So no place is more central than Concordia, Kansas. So we're thrilled that it's here, and we're thrilled that to be working with such a dedicated group as the National Orphan Train Complex, and we hope that this research center will be of great benefit to everyone across the nation as we try to get the word out about this important era in our history.
Beginning in 1800, after the War of 1812, America changed dramatically on the East Coast. Prior to about that time, there were no slums in American cities. The rise of industrialization, the increase in the numbers of immigrants coming to America caused a dichotomy to develop in American cities, that there were affluent sections versus poverty-stricken sections. And that caused a great strain on social services, on police services. Children were oftentimes had to raise themselves because parents had to work so hard, died young, led lives of crime in order to survive, especially immigrant children. And so it was a different, changing time in America.
By 1900, New York City had 3.5 million people. Ellis Island was processing 2,000–3,000 people a day at its peak. And people coming in, thinking this was the land of milk and honey, and finding themselves in a pretty desperate situation. And I think a lot of the children had parents, maybe lost a parent, had both parents that just couldn't afford to keep them, and in desperation had to relinquish the children. New York City sometimes is described as a beautiful woman with a dirty neck, which I think is a pretty good description. Chicago, St. Paul, a lot of the other cities were pretty much the same, not as large, but also with desperately poor populations.
So this Charles Brace created the Children's Aid Society, hoping to set children into a happy life, a Christian life, a rural life. He was very much a primitivist. The best life is living close to nature being close to God. And so he thought that that would be the perfect solution to the children who had no one to care for, had no access to education, had no access to nurturing medical attention, to send them off to a rural environment where somebody could tend to them and provide for them until they were 21.
Brace was an upper middle class, not quite aristocrat, but somewhat, came from a fairly well-to-do family, and he was very well educated, had gone to a theological seminary with the idea that he was going to be a missionary to the poor in the city. And he did begin to work among the poor, and pretty soon he decided that he wasn't going to work with adults. He decided adults were beyond salvation in most cases, and he decided to devote all of his time to children. Brace and the Aid Society became synonymous with sending children out of the cities with the orphan train program. And they didn't call it the orphan trains. That term didn't really come into use until the 1970s. They called it placing out. We kind of think of all the kids being, taken off the street or taken out of orphanages, but that wasn't the case. Brace wanted to place children who were the most likely to be accepted in their new communities, which meant that he chose children, most of them with West European backgrounds, English, German, Scandinavian, Scottish, the kids that looked the most like the communities where they would be sent. And he also preferred Protestant children over Catholic, but he never really asked a lot of questions, so you did have sometimes children going into homes of different faiths. And Brace was very concerned too in these children being accepted that they not have visible physical handicaps. And he never approved of placing African American children, even after the Civil War and slavery and the slave trade was over. He never approved of placing African American children, even after the Civil War and slavery and the slave trade was over.
He never approved of placing African American children, even after the Civil War and slavery and the slave trade was over.
And you know, if we place this in the context of the times, late 19th century, early 20th century, life was not good for a lot of children, especially poor children. And I think that the whole concept that maybe, hopefully, they would have a better life. And that was the whole idea. Many didn't. Many were used as strictly slave farm labor.
Probably about 90% of the children had at least one living parent. But in 19th century terminology, if you had just one living parent, you were called a half-orphan. And so technically, you were an orphan. And children with one parent, or even both, were sometimes placed out. And in the AIDS Society accounts, you find stories of parents who, and a lot of these people are immigrants, who are desperately poor, can't imagine how they're going to take care of their children, and so believing that they're giving their children a new chance at life, a chance for an education, food, a roof over their heads, they turn them over to the AIDS Society to be placed with a family that they believe will take care of all of those real necessities.
Well, I came out west when I was about 2.5, but I didn't know any of this till I was 27 years old. I didn't even know I was an adopted child. But as far as I could figure out, that my mother probably left the hospital, because in those days they kept them 10 days. And the history tells me that I was put in the New York Foundling Hospital when I was 10 days old. So I figured that she just walked out of the hospital, didn't know what to do, and that was the closest place.
Where the children go really depends, first of all, if there's a train system that reaches them. And so, and also there has to be a local population willing to take the children. So you find the first placements in the 1850s, 1860s in the states east of the Mississippi River. And then after the Civil War, when the train network begins to spread westward, and you have this huge influx of settlers like Kansas did after the Civil War, then you have a local population that's willing to take children, and even in some cases demanding, because there is a need for more people to help build up the country. So in states that you have a very small population and very few rail lines, places like Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, you find very few placements, whereas in states like Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, you find quite a few. It's hard to know exactly what the numbers were that came to any of these states. The AIDS Society kept records, the Foundling Home kept records, but again, they're not always complete.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Never knew who her mother was or who her father was, and you'd hear her talk about it sometime. You know, I don't know anything about my family, you know, who they were, and she had caught wind sometime that they was killed in an accident, so we never did know for sure or not if that's what happened to them. Now, one time she tried to go back and research a little bit, and the thing that I was told at the time, that orphanage where she had stayed at had burned down and they'd lost all their records. Now, whether that was true or whether they just didn't want to pass them on, them days a lot of your kids adopted, they just They couldn't find out much about themselves. Now, we did find out then later after Mom died and he run that search, she was 2 years older than what she always claimed she was. But that's one nice thing about not having a record. You can claim what your age is.
I just heard about it when I was taking care of my husband's great aunt before she died. And in talking, she would tell me of some stories about how it happened, and told me she had the clothes, stored away downstairs. And after she died, then I found them, and I knew that's what they were because she had shared with me about it. So she was born in 1901, and I think she said she came in 1903. She said she was almost 3 years old. Came into Ellenwood, and she said her story was that they lined him up out by the side of the train, and she looked over and remembered seeing the lady in the black dress, and she selected her, and then she said they came towards them, and the rest got back on the train.
What's interesting is when you look at these pictures of crowded ships of immigrants or orphan trains. Most if not all of the adults and children are white. Well, remember when I said the word slave comes from Slav, which is defined as one of the people who inhabit most of Eastern Europe. Another word for dumb, or foreigner, of different voice. Well, we are told the white people responsible for the colonization of the modern world were the British. Right? Well, the word Briton was also used to mean serf or slave. Another is Dasi, which means pre-Aryan inhabitant of India. The company responsible for the colonization of many countries was the British East India Company. The Caribbean is considered the West Indies, and in part 1 we showed the connection between the West Indies and Europe. Can we then assume that Europe is East India? A term for Indians in the Caribbean is coolie, which is a name given by Europeans to hired native laborers employed in menial work in India and China. It comes from the word coolie, which means hired servant. Usually with etymology, it traces a word back to its oldest form, but so far the results we receive relating to this subject are Old English with some of the root words not seeming related phonically. If slave comes from Slav, then what would then be the Slavic word for slave? The Old Slavic word for slave is orbu from the root orb, which also means thing that changes allegiance or to pass from one status to another. It is also the source of the word robot and orphan. Orphan from the late Latin orphanus means parentless child, or from the Greek orphanos or orphos, which means literally bereft or deprived. The root orbho meaning deprived of free status. The robot connection is through the word rabata, which means forced labor, drudgery, or rabota, which means servitude, or rabu, which means slave. It is a cousin to the German word Arbeit, which means work. And the word robot is a person whose work or activities are entirely mechanical, from Czech robotnik, which means forced worker. We see this common theme of whiteness being related to slavery, work, or a lower class. For example, when we search the word honky, which is a derogatory term for white people, we get definition East Central European immigrant or factory hand, which connects to the term honky-tonk, which is used to describe something cheap, low-grade, or most disreputable.
Well, I grew up on a small farm, and a cotton farm in West Tennessee, about 60 miles out of Memphis, and had all those comforts of a farm family as far as that goes. We had black and white TV that had 3 fuzzy channels, and we worked the fields and everything along with white kids and black kids, and we were sharecroppers with my grandfather. I grew up on a small farm, and a cotton farm, and we were sharecroppers with my grandfather.
Now when we connect the idea of orphan trains, robots, eugenics, Cabbage Patch, and incubator babies, is it possible white people were originally engineered as some sort of working slave class? If by white historians and white scientists' own admission we are all from Africa and the original Europeans were dark-skinned, where did all the modern white Europeans come from? If we look at the comments on Mind Unveiled's videos regarding this, it's apparent many white people are not fully aware of their origin. Some even confirm the orphan status of their great-grandparents. This is reminiscent of the movie series Aliens, as the eggs in those movies closely resemble that of a cabbage patch.
I'm very sorry that your engineers are all gone, Dr. Holloway.
You think we wasted our time coming here, don't you?
Your question depends on me understanding what you hope to achieve by coming here.
What we hope to achieve was to meet our makers, to get answers. Why they even made us in the first place.
Why do you think your people made me?
We made you because we could.
Can you imagine how disappointing it would be for you to hear the same thing from your creator?
Notice that the android in this scene was created to be a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man. What did this android perceive or learn about humankind that compelled it to consistently dye its hair to achieve this particular look? This brings us to the alien angel theory, which is surprisingly a popular theory, even with shows dedicated to this. Some stating white people come from red-haired giants, or a variety of pale aliens of different names and origins, to conspiracies claiming them to be shape-shifting reptilian species. There are many myths and texts, including the Bible, that have stories of beings, aliens or fallen angels procreating with the beings on Earth. This is the Greek version.
Within the Phoenician kingdom of Tyre, there was a beautiful princess. Her name was Europa. She was the child of King Agenor, a descendant of the highest Egyptian nobility. The king bestowed upon his beautiful daughter a majestic dress. It used to belong to her mother, the nymph Libya, who received it as a gift from her lover Poseidon. The young girl glowed with splendor as she wore the dress made by the gods, so much so that her beauty attracted the attention of Zeus on Olympus. During the night, the princess experienced a strange dream. Two divine women were fighting. One had Eastern features, the other looked Western. The winner would get the ownership of Europa. The West-looking woman came out the winner. She addressed the young Europa and said that one day she would be whisked away to a distant land, where she would be delivered to Zeus. Europa awoke frightened, although wondering if what had happened was just a nightmare or a legitimate prophecy. In the morning, the princess went for a walk by the sea with her friends, unaware that Zeus, brimming with lust, was watching them. Zeus converted into a beautiful white bull and decided to approach the girls. They quickly noticed the superb animal and approached him. The white bull seemed gentle and exuded a sweet aroma. Europa and her friends began to caress its soft hide and marveled at such a beautiful bull. One of the young girls decided to ride on the animal, but the dashing Princess Europa was quicker. With the help of her friends, she rode on the bull. The bull-shaped Zeus slowly led the princess down the beach, while the young women were overjoyed and delighted. One of her friends mentioned that she also wanted to ride the animal. Zeus hastened his step towards the sea waters. The bull and the young girl walked into the water. The animal swam splendidly and appeared to surf the waves. Europa was elated by the experience, but suddenly realized that the bull was leading her into the open sea. Frightened, she grabbed onto the animal, fearing she would drown. They both sailed through the blue sea for a long time. It was nightfall, and finally the bull led the young girl to dry land and then left her. The young girl was afraid, as she did not know her whereabouts. Europa was hopelessly considering taking her own life. Then, the beautiful woman she had met in her dream appeared. She was the goddess Aphrodite, who said that during the princess's dream, she had earned the right to the presence of such a beautiful young woman in the West. The girl just wanted to know why she was there. The goddess of love told her that she had been kidnapped by a bovine Zeus. She didn't have to worry, for he would devote much love to the princess and planned great honors for her future offspring. Zeus then appeared and introduced himself to the young woman. He said that they were in Crete, the land where the great god had been born. However, from that day on, the island would belong to Europa's descendants with the god. Rhadamanthus and Minos, the future legendary king of Crete, were born from the union of Zeus and Europa. Europa became immortalized, as now all the lands of that distant region would be known by her name.
If we consider that Zeus Ammon is a Greek depiction of Aethiops or Amun-Ra, then the allegory becomes more clear. This is not to suggest that white people in general are a hybrid, but to approach the subject with different perspectives. For example, certain inbreeding practices or even radiation sickness could have led to different mutations that caused certain bloodlines to lose pigment or develop rare conditions. You may then ask, but what about black tribes that have been isolated for centuries? In these instances, these groups procreate with enough separation to avoid genetic issues as opposed to those who marry first cousins and in some cases siblings like we see in other popular cases such as Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, royal families, etc. If we are going to categorize white people as a separate species, it cannot apply to all white people as most people have some amount of mixed genetics. And even centuries ago, Moors were known to have harems of white women who they sometimes interbred with, creating various mixed races of people who still exist today.
I received an email from a person who wants to remain anonymous, and this is what he said to me. He is a geneticist, a full-blown geneticist. And he says, "Dear Mr. Pye, I agree with your conclusions and will give you a few hints, if you wish, as a DNA deep throat. First, look up the huge discontinuities between man and the various apes for whole mitochondrial DNA, genes for the Rh factor, and human Y chromosomes, among others. Regarding number 3, the chromosomes, I refer you to K.D. Smith's 1987 study titled Repeated DNA Sequences of the Human Y Chromosome. It says most human Y chromosome sequences so far examined do not have homologs, which are similar sequences, on the Y chromosomes of other primates. Human female DNA does look somewhat ape-like, but not the male Y. This means that if we are a crossbred hybrid species, as you contend, meaning me, the cross had to be between a female ape-like creature, a creature of the earth, as the Sumerians said, and a male person from elsewhere. The cross had to be between a female ape-like creature, a creature of the earth, as the Sumerians said, and a male person from elsewhere."
If we had to make a separate category, I believe the wild man would be more accurate. There are many very old paintings and documents depicting white men as hairy wild men. Some of this folklore has managed to survive up to modern times. This isn't just folklore either, as certain groups are known for rare genetic conditions not common in black people. And some people are even born with tails. I could not find any instances of black people being born with tails, however there is not much information regarding the subject. Also, another definition of white appears as Old English white, meaning living being, creature, person. It can be translated from Old Saxon white, meaning thing or demon. A creature is defined as a created being or person who owes his rise and fortune to another. If you then look up the word clone, a figurative definition is one who slavishly imitates another. To behave slavishly or to Slavicize is to make Slavic in quality or characteristics or cause to become adapted to slavism. Slavism is a movement which crystallized in the mid-19th century. It is the political ideology concerned with the advancement of integrity and unity for the Slavic people. In part 1, we asked if one group is possibly impersonating another. When you break down the word imposter, you get imp from Old English impa, which means young shoot or to graft, possibly from late Latin impetus, which means implanted. But then the sense of the word has shifted from plants to people, via the meaning child, offspring. By the 14th century its prior definition is obsolete and then means little devil. And poster, meaning a child or someone given prominence in certain causes, another earlier definition as one who travels post. We see a connection to giants and gods being in the connected term vate, which means spirit of the earth or gnome. More research shows this is some sort of spirit in Norse mythology. The term can be used to refer to elves, dwarves, giants, gods, and a variety of earth spirits. One of the variants of vate is referred to as Landvat. The four Landvat are traditionally regarded as the protectors of the four quarters of Iceland. The dragon, Dreki, in the east, the eagle, Gamjor, in the north, the bull, Griangor, in the west, and the giant, Bergrisi, in the south, which are still represented on Iceland's coats of arms. Today, I believe this is reason why you don't see many if any black people in fantasy tales, such as Lord of the Rings or The Witcher etc. Because many of these tales are based on real Slavic folklore, and it's possibly more than a creative decision to leave black people out of these tales. Although disguised as fantasy, there are possibly truthful elements to these stories and are very personal to white people, which is why they are so revered. It is possible they are the allegories and historical narratives of Slavic people that were left out of history. The Witcher in particular is a series with a very detailed universe. It is about a world trying to rid itself of magic, magical beings, and certain creatures of old. This series conveniently takes place around the 13th century, which would place it during the Crusades, although there are no mentions to any Earth history or relations to our reality outside of its Slavic connections and folklore. It's possible some of these stories have taken place in some context, as there are old maps and documents that depict creatures like dragons, giants etc. to be genuine beings that exist. If you were to focus on any black characters in such a story, not only would you have to include more black characters as their families, offspring etc., you would then have to explain their presence among the other characters and in that time period.
Your Majesty, if I may have your attention, the messenger from Normandy, Jamal Skywalker.
Happy what's up? What's happening, y'all? Thank you. Appreciate it, big homie. Thank you. It's the woo, woo, woo. What's up? Hey, what's up there? Oh, man. This is a hell of a setup you got here. I mean, I'm not lying. I mean, whoo, you got to have major coins behind this. Silence more.
And since you can't refer to them as black, you would either have to address them as Moors or in some related historical context. This reinforces the subconscious that black people only existed in Africa and would have no reason to be present in such tales. It's also important that the theory of evolution has it that humans evolved from ape-like beings, which could be a specific origin for white people in general, as this was a theory created by Charles Darwin, who was often called a racist. If white people in these times genuinely saw themselves as superior to black people, I'm sure they would create a separate origin for black people specifically. It is actually more likely that if there were reptilians or aliens, it's possible they would be black people rather than white. We don't use the Bible as reference because not everyone is religious or subscribes to the beliefs in that book either literally or allegorically. However, in the Bible there's an argument of stolen birthright between brothers Jacob and Esau. In the Bible, Esau is described as a hairy man and Jacob a smooth man. Today we know black people to be considerably less hairy than white people. You can also consider that when you shave an animal down to its skin, it's usually pale or pink. Is it possible white people are the relatives of these ape-like beings but with significantly less hair due to interbreeding with other groups? Let's say white people did evolve from apes. Is it possible they were the original inhabitants of Earth, existing on the land in the natural food chain, and those who arrived on boats with new languages, religions, sciences and customs were the aliens? Also, wouldn't racism towards blacks make a lot more sense if that were the case, as well as a more logical reason to keep this specific group and their history suppressed? I also relate the aliens or reptilians to black people, as the concept of the blue or green man often alludes to black people. If we look at pop culture, we will see a reoccurring theme of ape beings versus reptilians or man versus blue or green antagonist. We can connect these themes to reality as we see here with the Infinity Gauntlet from the comics that appears to be based on a relic called the Incorrupt Hand of Saint Teresa of Avila. Although this is the official description, I believe it is more likely this belonged to a man as the finger digit length as that of a male. In a more literal sense, one can have blue skin as a result of methemoglobinemia.
Martin Fugate and his wife, Elizabeth Smith, came to Troublesome Creek, an out-of-the-way region of Appalachia. According to family stories, Martin Fugate, who started life as a French orphan, Martin Fugate, who started life as a French orphan,
Martin Fugate, who started life as a French orphan,
was blue himself. This remains unconfirmed, but even if it wasn't true, his offspring certainly ended up with an unusual appearance. His son Zechariah was born with blue skin, and so were 3 more of their 7 children. Due to the isolated nature of the community, the Fugates' neighbors knew about the blue people, but few outsiders did. So where did that blue color come from? Well, according to later research, the Fugates had an incredibly rare genetic defect that resulted in a condition called methemoglobinemia. This meant that their blood didn't carry as much oxygen around the body as the blood of an ordinary person does. That, in turn, makes the blood much darker, which then causes the skin of Caucasians to appear blue, and their lips to look purple. In addition, arterial blood looks chocolate brown rather than red. People with methemoglobinemia also have higher levels of methemoglobin in their blood. They may have 10 to 20% versus the average person's less than 1%. All that is to say, the Fugates' very blood was different from that of their neighbors. Well, that's an easier way to say it than methemoglobinemia. Newsflash: inbreeding is never really a good thing. In fact, Weird History viewers who saw our video about Charles II of Spain might even recall inbreeding was ultimately responsible for ending the Habsburg dynasty and plunging Europe into a war of succession. And it was inbreeding that was also responsible for the Smurf-like appearance of the Fugates of Kentucky. Yes, Martin Fugate and his bride, Elizabeth Smith, both carried the same recessive gene that causes methemoglobinemia. It wouldn't have affected future generations of Fugates if they hadn't married within the family. The Fugates, however, lived in an isolated area that had no railroads and barely any regular roads at all. This geographical situation greatly limited their options and resulted in a situation where most family members had little choice but to marry cousins who lived nearby. Some of the other family branches were the Stacys, the Richies, the Smiths, and the Combs. So, for example, Zechariah Fugate, one of the first known blue Fugates, married his aunt. One of their sons married a close cousin. In turn, one of their children married another cousin. In the end, it made for a collection of blue individuals united by one of the most confusing family trees in history. As one of the family members, Alva Stacy, once quipped to a researcher, "I'm kin to myself."
In the Marvel Universe, mutants are humans who are born with a genetic trait called the X gene, which grants them natural superhuman abilities. Due to their differences from the majority of humanity, mutants are subject to prejudice and discrimination, and many X-Men stories feature social commentary on bigotry and justice. The mutants are broken into 2 factions, one led by Professor Charles Xavier and another by Max Eisenhart aka Magneto. One group strives to assimilate and integrate into society, and the other group attempts to separate. Writers of the comics have stated the inspiration for these characters come from civil rights figures such as Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but I believe it's a bit deeper than that. In the current Marvel storyline, the warlike mutant nation is Morocco, and they have moved to the planet Mars. I believe this is a reference to the Moorish nation Morocco and the Fomorians, who are also associated with Mars. Just to name a few of the connections regarding Marvel Comics. The newest villain that will appear in their new series of movies will be a villain named Kang the Conqueror, who was blue in the comics but will be depicted in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as actor Jonathan Majors. Kang is also known as Rama Tut, an Egyptian pharaoh. Which brings us back to the Crusades and why I believe these allegories and deities to be important to understanding the overall picture. What if the spread of Christianity and the image of Christ signifies a change in the paradigm of reality and control? The same reason Amun became Zeus could be the same reason we consider Jesus to be white. There are many theories that Jesus Christ was an allegory for Julius Caesar. Some even claim the BC affixed to our timeline actually means before Caesar. But what if it means the same thing, as we also get our modern image of Christ modeled after Caesar Borgia?
Now remember how this all happened, because the religions that are in the English tradition, it was like they just passed those traditions right over in the language. So despite the Christianity and all that, because these Anglo-Saxon kings, mainly the ones that are what they call upper gentry, the highborns, when they accepted Christianity, they accepted Christianity as a way to unify their colonies, but they never changed their they never changed their beliefs. They never changed their heritage and their lineage. So what happened was everybody just inherited their lineage and then accepted it. And so if you became a serf, which is basically anybody who was absorbed into their kingdom, if you became a Slav, or Slovenian or slave in their fiefdom, then you worship their king Gud as a god, because everybody in that realm that was a ruler had to be able to prove that they were a descendant of these highborn angelic or English bloodlines. Okay, so we're going to look real quick here. We're not going to harp on this, but we just want to make sure it's very clear that, because when people are telling you and they're asking you, why is all this happening? Why is God allowing this to go on? They need to understand that this is what God does. From that word, and maybe you just have a different definition of what we're talking about, but you need to be very clear with your words, because when you try to take somebody else's name and that name is already bound within the stars, you're not going to just change that, meaning that the Germanic god Gud's energy or vibration, because this is what they say in the tradition, that 3,000, 4,000 years ago, you didn't see any of the gods in this culture specifically depicted as like humans, but more as like energies that exist within things.
The reason that people have not recognized that the character Jesus Christ is fiction is simply because they haven't understood the genre that the Gospels were written in. The Gospels are in fact a Roman mockery of a kind of literature that the Jews produced in the first century. And this type of literature is referred to as typology. Typology is simply basing one character upon another, and it is found throughout Hebraic literature in the Old Testament to link one prophet to another prophet. At the very first page of the book of Matthew, the author has created a primer, a small example of the typology that's going to extend throughout all of the works. And what Matthew has done is he has taken stories from the Old Testament and placed them into his story of the pre-ministry of Jesus. He has taken names, locations, and concepts from the Old Testament, and he has woven them into his story about Jesus Christ. And he has placed them in the same sequence, so that when you compare one story to the other, the Old Testament with the New Testament, you can see that Moses was connected very directly to the character that Matthew is writing about, Jesus Christ. The reason that Moses was chosen as the archetype of Jesus is because he was the first Savior of Israel. And so by connecting him directly to that particular Hebraic prophet, you show that Jesus Christ is also a Savior of Israel.
Three kingdoms, and one crown for him who rules them all. Now the three kings are paying tribute to their new Lord, Jesus Christ. Or was it Julius Caesar? Let's take a look at the list of popes. On Christmas Day of the year 800, Leo III is crowning Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor. So we have the first list, put the remaining 800 years next to it. That brings us to the year 33, the death of Jesus Christ. That made Peter the first pope appointed by Christ. Now Leo III, as lawful descendant of Jesus Christ, can crown Charlemagne as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Let's return to the list of the popes. But let's put the second list on the other timeline. That brings us to the year 450. So in 476 you have the fall of the Roman Empire. That means you have 450 years of Roman emperors. And that brings us to Julius Caesar. In the first timeline, the year 0 is Jesus Christ. In the other timeline, the year 0 is Julius Caesar. What happened here? Let me give you an example. So you have Mao, psychopathic killer, responsible for millions of deaths. But to hide all this, you create a propaganda Mao, the completely opposite of the real Mao. Now let's presume you want to make two different people out of this Mao. What would you do? You take the propaganda Mao and you call him Lao. You take the real Mao, but you give him a different face. Now you have Mao and Lao. So let's turn this equation. You have Julius Caesar with the wrong face. And you have Jesus Christ with the wrong name. I already showed you that in the Middle Ages, Julius Caesar was depicted with a beard. So I think there might be some evidence in the Shroud of Turin. Some people have made a 3D replica. Let's take a look at the body wounds. For every body wound of Caesar, they have found a Christian explanation. There goes the Spear of Destiny. So Julius Caesar is not the short-haired, grey old man, but a long-haired, bearded young man. Something like this, except for the nose maybe. Julius Caesar had an arched nose with a tip curved downwards at the end.
Children will ask you, what did you do in the greatest war? And you can tell them, I fought to protect this world. We created them. But now, we will bring an end to their kind.
No mercy, no peace. This is war.
According to the Islamic calendar, it is around 1444, which is almost a 600-year discrepancy from our current timeline. Shouldn't this be applied when studying anything prior to the Reconquista? It's possible we have no idea what year it actually is or how recent any of these events in history actually took place. Since we hear stories of Genghis Khan's genetic relation to a large portion of the Asian population, what if, as strange as it sounds, Jesus Christ was an allegory for Julius Caesar? And Julius Caesar was an allegory for the first white Cabbage Patch baby. That could be considered a virgin birth, and after all, Caesar is where we get the term cesarean section from, as that's how he was apparently born. Which is interesting considering in modern times cesarean sections have only recently been deemed a safe procedure around the 1950s. So allegedly we knew how to do them in 100 BC, then I guess we forgot until the 1600s and then remembered again 350 years later. In conclusion, we have white people coming to America on ships, working on plantations, orphans unable to trace back their roots escaping harsh conditions by railroads, and men being depicted as subhuman and ungodly. This is not much different from the storyline given to the black Americans. Assuming everyone is white based on the historical narrative we're given is just as ignorant as assuming all dark-skinned people are Africans and therefore slaves whenever outside of Africa. This is important when studying history, as we should look at everything with an open and objective mind. As we see, there is nothing that actually defines someone as white, so with that considered, what makes an Arab or Hispanic person not white? Considering we have terms like Afro-Latino or Afro-Asiatic, etc., we don't seem to have a clear definition of whiteness, but rather a definition of who's not black. The psychologist Dr. Francis Cress Welsing theorizes that racism may exist as a genetic defense mechanism. That whiteness cannot survive without blackness, as a good superhero needs a good villain. And in a more literal sense, without racism, black people would be more empowered and interracial relationships more common. Ultimately creating a population of darker people over time, eventually breeding out whiteness naturally. This is an interesting take. As I mentioned in part 1, I find it peculiar that white people could have been around as long as they claim in diverse environments without eventually becoming darker. However, we have touched on even weirder hypotheses and subject matter. At this point, anything is plausible.
Well, the Cress theory was an attempt back in the late 1960s to explain what I thought is the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy. An attempt to, as a psychiatrist, as a black psychiatrist, to understand, well, what exactly is this thing that we call racism, white supremacy? Looking at why do white people behave in the way that they do. Do you see, in concluding that it has to do, number one, with their minority status on the planet, their genetic recessive status, in that they could experience genetic annihilation, in that the overwhelming majority of people on the planet are black, brown, red, and yellow, and whites constitute fewer than 1/10 of the people on the planet. You see, and it's a illogical statement to talk about a majority minority. I mean, which is like white supremacy. I still have to put myself on top. I have to pose that I am genetically superior. To compensate, I say it's a compensation for a genetic recessive status. Well, I think I was the first person to talk about white genetic annihilation in those terms, and that racism is ultimately a total system for white genetic survival and to prevent white genetic annihilation on a planet that has the genetics and the demographics that exist on third planet from the sun, which is planet Earth. So I was the first to put it in those terms, and my thesis has not been refuted. I would say that if my definition is understood, that racism, white supremacy is the fear on the part of people who classify themselves as white about white genetic annihilation and the concern for white genetic survival. This would therefore mean logically and specifically that the focus has to be on black males, because black people have the greatest genetic potential to produce the black pigment melanin, which gives all skin color. And since we have the highest level of genetically determined ability to produce this pigment that can cause white genetic annihilation, and it's only males who can impose sexual intercourse. And so the focus consciously, subconsciously has to zero in on the males. This is why I say that understanding, I'm not talking about institutional racism, I'm talking about a total system construct that develops out of certain patterns of thinking on the part of people who classify themselves as white relative to specific realities that exist on this planet. And so then once that is understood, that the fear of genetic annihilation that takes to the focus on the male, the black male person, as being the number one perceived threat, the number one enemy, and everything flows from that.
White people did not exist before 1681. Again, white people did not exist on planet Earth until 1681. Number two, any claim that this group called white people, any claim that that group is rooted in biology or derived from genes or biology or is innate or is from nature is a lie. Third and final point. As a matter of foundational law, actually let me say it this way, white supremacy has been embedded in the United States of America from its founding as a matter of law. Now, I don't expect you to buy all that, to get all that, to believe all that, at least not now. But my job is to share with you the legal history that proves each of those three claims that I begin with. So let's go. Let's get started. We have to begin this conversation in colonial North America, specifically in the colonies, the British colonies of Maryland and Virginia. Both were British colonies, and both shared a number of particular characteristics. First, their economies were rooted in tobacco farming. If you know much about tobacco farming, it requires tremendous human labor. Lots and lots of workers. So those who owned large plantations, big landholders, constantly needed laborers to do the work to grow the tobacco. In addition to sharing an economic base, both colonies had an incredible gender imbalance, roughly 10 men for every woman. Now, let's understand a little bit about the folks who constitute the people in these two colonies. Oh, and by the way, let me give you a year. We're in the early 1600s, okay? The early part of the 17th century, colonial North America. England had, for some bizarre reason that today demographers cannot explain, there was a population boom in England in the early 17th century. So there were lots and lots of poor British people who were on the public doles, who couldn't find a way to make a living, who couldn't feed themselves. So the king in England was quite happy to have them sign a contract of indenture to then go work in the British colonies. And that is what happened. Both indentured and enslaved persons, according to historian Edmund Morgan, were sold and traded like cattle. But of course, not all laborers stand equal in terms of their labor agreement or lack thereof. Those who came under a term of indenture worked for a term of years, and presumably this indenture was an agreement that they chose to enter into. The terms of indenture were largely protected by British law, although the terms that took form in colonial North America were quite different than those that existed in England. For example, in England, indentured servants could marry because that was viewed as the way to produce the next group of workers. In this country, indentured servants were prohibited from marrying, and if women were unfortunate enough to get pregnant during their term of indenture, they added usually about 7 to 9 years onto their term of indenture and 1 year to the father. Slavery, of course, was a status that came with life, work for life. There was neither British law nor international law to prohibit or restrict slavery. What we do know is that at this time period in colonial North America, there were free persons of African descent. We know that landholders freed slaves. They did so in wills. They did so by allowing them to purchase their own freedom or the freedom of a family member. The vast majority of workers, laborers, in colonial North America at this time were British men, British workers, the vast majority. There were some women, there were some European laborers from Portuguese, Dutch, folks from Ireland and from Scotland are also revealed in the records, but the vast majority were British men. There were small numbers of persons of African descent, and there were even smaller numbers of members of native tribes. But in this slide, I'm trying to capture the socioeconomic ladder, and really that ladder should be about as long as this room. The landholding elite are, in today's parlance, that's the 1%. And the vast majority of folks who were in the colonies were laborers. Again, they were British, other Europeans, Africans, and members of native tribes. Here's what I find folks have the most difficult time with. We tend to really struggle with getting a good picture of social life, the social context at this juncture. We're very good at understanding the social relations that exist later, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But pre-Bacon's Rebellion society is something that we generally in this country struggle to grasp. So I'm going to do my best to paint a broad stroke picture of this time period. What we know is that British and African laborers worked, ate, and slept together. Furthermore, the evidence from this period, which covers the first 3/4 of the 17th century, that the anecdotal evidence reveals that they lived under similar conditions and faced the same opportunities and chances to make it once one was free of their term of service, whether free of enslavement or free of indenture. So let's review this. British laborers constituted the vast majority of the populations in both colonial Maryland and colonial Virginia. All men, of course, because the law of coverture, let me tell you something about that law of coverture. The law of coverture is derived from British common law, and it structures marriage. And this is how Barrister Blackstone famously described the law of coverture. In marriage, the man and the woman become one, and the one is the man. You didn't have the right to retain your own wages. You couldn't create estate planning, wills, or trusts without the approval of a man. So all men who were free of indenture or enslavement faced the same opportunities in these colonies as a matter of law. For example, free men of African descent could own servants or slaves, and they did. They could vote, and they did. They could marry persons of the opposite sex. God, and I love that I have to make that qualification now. Woo! They could marry persons of the opposite sex regardless of national origin, and they did. In fact, marriages between men of African descent and women primarily of British descent were not uncommon at all. In one county, 1/2 of the free men of African descent were married to a European woman. There was a challenge to these marriages, but it did not come from the masses. It came from elites, and that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, this little depiction is meant to be a depiction of the lawmakers in Maryland, colonial Maryland lawmakers. They passed a law in 1664 punishing, and I quote, British and other freeborn women who marry enslaved Negro men. The punishment for entering into these marriages was that the woman herself would be enslaved for her husband's life, and any children they have would be enslaved into their 20s. Now imagine that you are a plantation owner. That's not a bad deal. I get more property. I like that. And that is exactly what happened. Rather than deter these marriages, which is the express intent of the law of 1664, rather than deter them, these marriages were encouraged by property owners because that, in fact, that such a marriage increased their property value. This law of 1664 represents, if not the first, certainly the precursor to anti-miscegenation law. These are laws that punished or prohibited marriage between, notice that white people didn't exist yet in 1664, at least as referenced in that law. But most generally speaking, anti-miscegenation law prohibited and punished marriages between a white person and a specific non-white person or persons. Let me be really clear. I read all the time in history books, in academic texts, and I read anti-miscegenation law described as prohibiting interracial marriage. That's not correct. For example, a member of a native tribe could marry a person of Chinese descent. Both were understood as racially distinct, but never did anti-miscegenation law prohibit such kinds of marriages. The only marriages that anti-miscegenation law prohibited were those between a white person and always a person of African descent, and sometimes various other groups. Okay, so just so we're really clear about anti-miscegenation law and its link to whiteness. A couple other things to note about anti-miscegenation law. It's not derived from British law. Anytime we look at law and study history and you see a break from British common law, you always want to pay attention because it tells us something about the needs and desires of those who wielded power in the colonial context. So anti-miscegenation law was one of these laws. They were passed colony by colony and then state by state. It's a really important area of law for a number of reasons. But for our purpose this morning is because it's where this human category called white first appears on planet Earth, the first time. In addition, anti-miscegenation law is important because it lasted more than 300 years. These anti-miscegenation laws literally shaped the faces of this group of more than 2,000 X number of people that I'm looking at today. The Maryland legislature sought to correct for the encouragement of marriages that they described in that previous law of 1664 as, quote, a disgrace, unquote, to the British people, as an indication that the, quote, British or freeborn woman must be forgetful of her status as free, end quote. So they passed the law of 1681, and in this law, it made it illegal for British and other white women from marrying a Negro slave. And furthermore, the law punished any landholder who encouraged the marriages and any religious authority who performed it. This law equals the invention of the human category white. Did these group of laborers, some of whom were from Portugal, some from Holland, some from Ireland, Scotland, did they have a little genetic transformation that occurred right after the General Assembly in Maryland met, creating a genetic sludge that we can now call white? Virginia passed its first anti-miscegenation law in 1691. In Virginia, The law prohibited both white men and white women from marrying a person of African descent or a member of a native tribe. But lest I leave you thinking that gender equality was being created in this law, let me quickly dispel that. Studies of antebellum courts reveal that, in fact, anti-miscegenation law was that, at least in the language of the law, prohibited these marriages for white men and white women. But here's what we know from antebellum court cases. We know that plenty of white men married and or engaged in intimate sexual relations with prohibited women. However, very rarely were they brought to court and punished under the anti-miscegenation law. Very rarely. So here, pay attention to this. This law, in its enforcement, is largely focused on controlling the relationality and the sexuality of white women and non-white men. Furthermore, think about the enforcement practices that come out of this particular law. What's the result? Who becomes more available for who? We see a further step in locating patriarchal power squarely among and within white men. We've talked about the law of 1664 and the amendment to that law in 1681. And we've noted that the key difference between those two is the reference to the group who's of concern. The language has shifted from British and other freeborn to British and other white women in that particular law. So the question becomes, well, what the heck happened between 1664 and 1681? And the answer is Bacon's Rebellion. This was a massive revolt in the colony of Virginia that lasted more than a year. Let me give some background of the seeds of this rebellion, what helped give rise to this violent outburst. Those who were enslaved, I don't think it's hard to imagine, were by definition of their status disgruntled laborers. And remember that pool of readily available workers from England who were poor and happily sent off in the guts of ships? Well, they dried up. That population surge ended, and there was no longer a pool of laborers from Britain available to handle the work on the plantations in the colonies. The result is they began to impose harsher punishments on indentured servants who were already here, so that relatively minor infractions would result in significant extensions to their years of service. Those who completed their term of indenture or who were released from their status as enslaved were frustrated. They were frustrated because the King of England gave almost all of the farmable land to his buddies. And even if they could find land to grow tobacco on, prices dropped and taxes went up. So land and other opportunities became much more limited. So this guy, Nathaniel Bacon, the guy pointing his arm, he didn't have to search very far for disgruntled laborers. Both those who were enslaved or indentured faced worse treatment, and those freed faced less ability to make a future for themselves. Persons of European and African descent fought in the first phase of Bacon's Rebellion against members of native tribes, and then in the second phase of Bacon's Rebellion against the British ruling elite. Nathaniel Bacon ultimately died from wounds that he received in a battle, and England sent troops into the colony, and that eventually quashed the rebellion. But not without having made a significant impression upon those who wielded authority and were threatened by this rebellion. Remember, this rebellion lasted over a year, and records from lawmakers in Virginia to the Legal Oversight Authority in England revealed that over 30% of the population were in support of the rebellion. Here were the lessons from Bacon's rebellion. A united labor force is a threat to the form of capitalism taking hold within the colonies. Virginia lawmakers wrote letters to the Oversight Authority in London explaining that they intended to pursue a divide and conquer strategy in order to prevent future rebellion. It's only after Bacon's rebellion that we see the emergence of white people as a group of humanity. Let's think about this for a minute. 1681, some lawmakers invent a new label for a group of people. Imagine, if you will, just for a second, for fun here, that I'm a lawmaker, and I just pass a law claiming that 3/4 of you in this room are crunchies. Okay? So 3/4 of you are crunchies, and the other quarter of you are not. Who gives a damn? Who would care? Some silly lawmaker came up with a label for you. It's really unlikely that it would mean much. But let's say I follow it with this. Those who are crunchies, you can pay no more than $25 a night for that hotel. No more. Those who are crunchies are the first to come into any room at this conference and the first to leave. The first in line at the bathroom, at lunch, at any other line that forms, and the first to get to leave. And that these privileges and advantages that come by virtue of this label that I asserted upon you as a lawmaker continues when you walk out these doors. That it shapes how you are treated and what you get to do for years and years to come. Imagine you're one of the crunchies. Imagine how you might start to feel. Wow, I must be special. Imagine you're not a crunchy. Wow, what's wrong with me? This is not fair. Let's return to the divide and conquer strategy. Laborers, prior and through Bacon's rebellion, were united. They lived the same darn lives. They faced the same opportunities, rights, and privileges once they were freed from enslavement or free from indenture. That's about to change. A slew of laws were passed in the decades after Bacon's rebellion and continued to get passed into the first quarter of the next century. The first slew of laws included the prohibition of free blacks from holding public office, the prohibition of blacks and native tribal members from marrying whites, the requirement that whites, upon completion of their terms of service, be paid goods including guns and gunpowder, a prohibition of free blacks possessing a weapon. We're going to come back to that. The prohibition of blacks testifying against whites. These laws began to give different meaning to these labels that prior to this moment just referenced where your nation of origin was. Not anymore. I want to return quickly to the law that prohibited free blacks from possessing a weapon. What this law did was essentially strip free black men of their ability to hold patriarchal power. Because look, under the law of coverture, here's how things worked. Men were in control, controlled women, their spouse, controlled their children, and had legal authority to do so, including severe beatings, all financial assets and land. The man had the control. But the exchange was that in exchange for that authority, he protects. That's the trade-off for patriarchal power. Stripped, made impossible by virtue of this law. And then let's look at this law that prohibited blacks from testifying against whites. We will see that throughout U.S. history. Mexicans prohibited from testifying against whites, Chinese prohibited from testifying against whites, and then it just becomes mongrels, the label, to include persons of Japanese descent and the like. So that's a law that we see throughout U.S. history. When you look at these laws, what's the message to white people? Each one of these laws has a message to this new group of people called white folks, on the one hand, and a message to those who it denies or restricts on the other. Each one of them. This package of laws, first passed after Bacon's Rebellion, did something extraordinary. Let's imagine that that light up there represents the landholding elite, the 1%. And this represents the socioeconomic ladder in the colony, okay? And so this hand over here represents this new group of laborers called white ones. And this hand over here represents laborers of African descent and members of native tribes. Before Bacon's Rebellion and through it, these laborers had the same lives, faced the same opportunities, and that changed. But when you look at these laws that passed that created this change, it divided these, created different meaning for this group versus this group, but it didn't do a whole lot to lift the economic status of white people closer to that of the white elites. Very little movement up. What it did do was it plummeted the bottom, created a new bottom to colonial society, and shoved persons of African descent and members of native tribes there. So let's look at this group of humanity called white people. We learn from this history that white people were built upon the idea that British had of themselves as white, as Christian, as freeborn, as deserving of rights and privileges from which others can be denied. To this day, white people have not been defined as a matter of law to this day. This history teaches us that white is the tool by which laborers were divided. Those who shared the same living conditions, the same opportunities, now experience ourselves as more connected with Paris Hilton than with our African American neighbor, even though our economic status is far more similar to that neighbor than to the lives of the 1%. But not only did this new organization of society create a new bottom to it, it created a link that heretofore had not existed, that connected this new group of laborers called white people with the elite. And what was that connection? This shared status called white, embedded with the presumption of its superiority. The other thing to note about the invention of white people and the meaning of white that this history reveals is that white constituted the center of patriarchal power. And we see that most clearly through anti-miscegenation law and specifically through its enforcement. We're going to move from the 17th century into the 18th century. The American Revolution has taken place, and the First Congress of the United States of America will meet for the first time. And when they meet, they will establish laws regarding citizenship in this new country. This is the building actually in New York where the first Congress met. Here are the men who represented the first Congress. These laws regarding citizenship include an area of law called naturalization law. Naturalization law provides the process by which one who is not born in a country can become a citizen. The first Congress of the United States determined 1790, that in order to become a naturalized citizen of this new republic called the United States of America, one had to be white. This was valid law in the United States until 1952. You had to be white to be a U.S. citizen. 1952. Now, as is often the case, laws impact those who are gendered female differently than those who are gendered male. No less true with the naturalization law. For example, white women who were citizens, if they dared to marry a man who was ineligible for citizenship via the naturalization law, in other words, he wasn't white, she loses her citizenship. These laws work to make white women most available to white men, and frankly, all women available to white men. The requirement of whiteness in naturalization law has had a significant impact on various groups of people who've come to the United States of America. In fact, the naturalization law was a significant piece of evidence used in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896 to determine that U.S. citizenship status and therefore the protections of the constitutions were never intended to be applied to persons of African descent. Naturalization law assured that the masses of Chinese laborers and then Japanese laborers and then various other groups of laborers who came to this country would remain cheap, dependent labor. Why? Because even though they were significant in number, especially relative to their employer and landholders and railroad companies, if you're not white, you're not a U.S. citizen. If you're not a U.S. citizen, you don't vote. If you can't vote, you can't voice your political needs and desires, thereby reducing these groups of people to dependent, cheap labor. In addition, naturalization law was used to block persons of Chinese and Japanese and Filipinos, and we could go on, various groups. Not only did it result in them getting paid less for doing the same job, but all kinds of taxes got imposed upon them. So there was a foreign wage tax, various laws were passed that blocked them from being able to work in the public sector, blocked them from being able to hold a managerial position, and then of course alien land laws were passed. These were laws that made it illegal for those ineligible for naturalization, i.e. not white people, made it illegal for them to own property. And so what's the result of these laws for white people, right? Because we're real good about seeing the harm that these laws cause for certain groups. But let's get the flip side of that coin. When I make land, when I make a whole group of people ineligible to purchase land, it makes more land available and cheaper for me, for white people. When you're the lowest paid worker and prohibited from moving up as a matter of law, then those positions that get paid more, that are more desirable, are more available to white people. So we see, just from this one law, and I could spend another hour with you at least going through these combinations of law, naturalization law, anti-miscegenation law, and immigration policy, all that combined in these ways to continue to advantage, to give economic value, symbolic value to white people, to give us the unearned advantages that we continue to receive today. I have a favor to ask. Would y'all close your eyes for a moment? Just close your eyes. Imagine a society where white supremacy is not embedded in our institutions. Sit with it. Think of the prison complex. Think of our education system. Think of church on Sunday, synagogue on Saturday, temple, mosque. Think about the organization of neighborhoods. Think about the government of the United States and how assets and resources would be distributed. Looks pretty different, doesn't it? White supremacy, you can open your eyes if you like, is institutionally embedded in the United States of America as a matter of foundational law.